Hi, honey. I'm all through. Boy, am I hungry. I could eat a horse.
You've been peeking.
For your information, you're looking at a man who just painted a 50-foot fence.
They got them on the fence, too.
Oh, brother. Well, your pancakes look a little lumpy.
That's corn.
Corn? In the pancakes?
Mm-hmm. Sound good?
They are good. What's the matter? The label too pretty to throw away?
Oh, be still. For your information, I'm saving this Niblets label to send in with the Aunt Jemima box top and get back the money I spent for the corn.
Try Aunt Jemima's Golden Corn Pancakes. Add 1/2 cup of Niblets to your batter. Aunt Jemima will refund the price you pay for the corn. For details, see this ad or check with your grocer. If you like pancakes, then sure as shakin', they're Aunt Jemima's.
All right, I'm watching some of these old commercials, and they have not aged well. It's 2021, and for at least a year now, questions of racial legacies in the United States have been on everyone's mind, and hopefully they've been on some of our minds for quite a bit longer than that. Whether it's something dramatic, like the specter of police killings and violence against people of color in the United States, or more insidious and subtle ways that racial legacies permeate our day-to-day life, questions of race really are on the forefront of everyone's minds. And they're also in the minds of companies like PepsiCo and the Quaker Oats Company, which have realized about 100 years too late that so many of their products are bound up in questions of race and racial injustice in the United States. Of course, this comes to mind with certain brands. Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben, Eskimo Pie, Mrs. Butterworth. These are toxic caricatures that are still in the foods we eat today. Except, it looks like things are changing. Let me read a statement from PepsiCo and the Quaker Oats Company, who own Aunt Jemima as a brand. They say here, it's the start of a new day. Aunt Jemima is now the Pearl Milling Company. Though the brand is new to store shelves, the name itself has been a part of our story for over 130 years. Pearl Milling Company was a small mill in the bustling town of St. Joseph, Missouri. Using a pearl milling technique, they produced flour, cornmeal, and beginning in 1889, the famous self-rising pancake mix that would go on to be known as Aunt Jemima. The story is a lot uglier than that, and we're going to come to it in just a second. Our pancakes have been bringing smiles to the breakfast table ever since. Last June, PepsiCo and the Quaker Oats Company made a commitment to change the name and image of Aunt Jemima, recognizing that they don't reflect our core values. While the name on the box has changed, the great tasting products, the pearl inside the familiar red box remains the same, with a mission to create joyful breakfast moments for everyone. We'll have future announcements regarding our community impact initiative. Well, looks like that's good news. Change a little bit too late, but change nonetheless. So I'm thinking we should take a look at some of these new products like Pearl Milling Company on the shelf. So, got my helmet here, my bike's behind me, and I'm going to head down to Happy Market, my neighborhood bodega, where I'm sure they'll definitely have some new products from the Pearl Milling Company. Be right back. All right, so here we are, Happy Market, South Street, Jamaica Plain. Fantastic bodega. Ton of stuff in here. Always surprised what I can find. Got a great dairy section. There's a butcher shop in the back. A lot of fantastic Latin American products. Again, fantastic bodega, but we're here on a mission. We're gonna see if they have any of the Pearl River Milling Company products. Looking, nope, just Aunt Jemima. Just still Aunt Jemima. Buttermilk Complete, definitely still Aunt Jemima. Hasn't been taken off the shelves. And looking around a little bit more, yeah, the imagery isn't even that much changed. They said they were gonna change that too, it was gonna be gone. I'm kind of surprised this is on the shelves at all. All right, looking around. Yep. Nope. Still Uncle Ben's, not Ben's original. Tons of Uncle Ben's. Actually, it's everywhere. Huge, incredible bags of Uncle Ben's rice. This, again, was also going to be changed pretty soon. Cream of wheat is still here. That was another one. And yep, Mrs. Butterworth's even in the same jar. Nothing has changed. Really looks like nothing's off the shelves yet. Well, it looks like PepsiCo and the Quaker Oats Company are a little slow getting that new product on the shelves. I don't mean to make light of that. I do think it's really good that companies as big as those are finally realizing that they can't profit anymore from this toxic racial imagery. On the other hand, I wonder why they weren't a little bit faster. While we wait for those changes, we're going to go back today and look at the origins of some of the ways in which we eat in the United States, and how they're inflected by the very particular set of race relations in the United States in the 19th and early 20th century. We'll consider the legacy of products like Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben, but we're also going to look at wider patterns of race in eating in the United States. And we're going to set the stage for future conversations about food justice and food injustice in the United States in the 21st century. Stay tuned. Hey everyone, I'm Benjamin Siegel, and welcome back to Taste, Culture, and Power. We've just talked about the different ways in which food and agriculture were central to processes of imperialism and colonialism in Asia and Africa. But now we're going to look at parallel processes in the United States from the 18th century to the present day. There's two parts to what we're going to cover. First, we're going to look at the different processes of cultural erasure that were involved in the creation of colonial foodways. Native peoples, enslaved Africans, and non-British immigrants were essential in creating colonial foodways in the Americas. But there were major anxieties about these particular roles, and they were very quickly erased and repressed. Secondly, we're going to look at the so-called century of immigration in the United States, the 100 years between the 1820s and the 1920s, when millions of primarily European migrants arrived in the United States. We're going to see how a new set of anxieties over the arrival of those migrants, as well as those from China and the slaves freed after the American Civil War, condition new food practices and beliefs that stretch with us until the present day. Let's start at the beginning. In their encounters with the native peoples of North America, early settlers from Europe were determined to maintain their own European roots, particularly in the realm of foods. This happened through two chief mechanisms. First was the decimation of the American Indian populations through warfare and disease, which opened up abundant land for raising new crops and new livestock. Secondly, African slaves provided a skilled agricultural labor force that was acclimatized to the intense summer conditions of the southern colonies in America in particular. These were really important advantages. Land in the Americas was acquired quickly and labor was cheap. So settlers were able to gain broad access to British dietary staples like beer, beef, and bread by the mid-18th century. The gentry and the merchants of the colonies were even able to import a number of luxuries to the United States, things like Madeira, cookbooks, tableware, and tea. But even though it was hidden, culinary blending was beginning to take place, and European foods were already being mixed with native and African counterparts. The colonists were really trying to repress this kind of mixing, and this began a long, some would argue even several hundred years long, tradition of repressing the historical memory of non-European cultural contributions to American foodways. The uneasy culinary relationship between European colonists and American Indians revolved around maize. In those harsh first few winters, the colonists at both Jamestown and Plymouth really depended on corn for their survival, and that corn, of course, was produced by local Indians since Europeans really didn't know how to grow it. But early settlers were anxious about eating maize directly. We have to understand a little bit of the cultural beliefs of those European colonists. Those colonists were scared by the climate of the colonies, which they thought was too hot or too cold and inhospitable to European bodies. They were scared of the foods that they found in the Americas, and they feared that those American foods would transform their European bodies into Indian bodies. At the same time, even though they were anxious, they recognized how productive corn is, and what it meant for their caloric abundance in places like the American Southwest. So they had to take this corn, which was culturally unedible, and make it edible. And so they did that by transforming it. They planted seeds for corn in neat rows. That was a proper English manner, rather than growing it intercropped with beans and squash according to the maize complex of Mesoamerica. And rather than eating it directly as things like porridge or tortillas, they fed it to livestock, or they would cook it in a familiar style like cornbread or johnny cake, or of course they could make whiskey out of it. But really, the most common and unglamorous method of maize consumption in North America, really the staple starch for British North America in the beginning years, relied upon Native American techniques. You might have had a hominy before. Hominy is a piece of corn that you dry, you soak, and then you cook in a solution of lye, and then you wash it very well to remove that lye. If this reminds you of something, it should. This is nixtamalization. It's that alkaline processing technique that was borrowed from Native Americans with the aim of maximizing that plant's nutritional value and its digestibility. Nixtamalization was essential, but there was no cultural acknowledgement that hominy was borrowed from a technique that Native Americans had owned over many millennia. This was the beginning of many processes of cultural erasure that characterized foodways in the early United States. Now, of course, we know the key role that the labor of African slaves had in one colonial commodity, and that's, of course, sugar. That was a product of African slaves that was made for European and also white American consumers. But in the colonies, African slaves were also involved and essential in the creation of another staple crop, and that was rice. The traditional account of rice in the Americas, and really this is in places like the American South, was that European planters brought over rice to the Americas and then figured out how to grow it in a new climate. But that evidence actually really breaks down, particularly when we look at the continuities between West African rice agriculture and rice agriculture in the Carolinas. It's clear that British colonial planters didn't just rely upon slaves for their labor and their bodies, but also for their knowledge. Rice planting was an enslaved African technique. Slaves brought with them knowledge of how to create levees and floodgates to irrigate rice. And those are exactly the rice-growing structures that we still see today in the wetlands around Charleston. Women played a really important role in this process. We've talked a little bit about one particular implement that was useful in African cuisine, the mortar and the pestle. And the mortar and the pestle moved with enslaved Africans to the United States to help mill rice in an era before mechanized industrial rice milling. So the skilled work of African women was indispensable for milling the rice with mortar and pestles. That was a back-breaking chore, and it required a tremendous amount of skill and dexterity. European settlers in the Americas were diverse themselves, and they contributed to a cultural diversity within primarily British North America, but they too were assimilated into a hegemonic colonial cuisine. There were German, Dutch, and Swedish immigrants, and they came over to the middle colonies and brought with them a range of dishes, including things like sausage or sauerkraut, waffles, and scapple, and these are all kind of staple foods of the Midwest or diners. In the South, Jewish immigrants to places like Charleston and Savannah negotiated a lot of regional and religious identities at the dinner table. They adapted the prescriptions of kosher eating to the demands of Southern hospitality. Even after they declared political independence from Britain, English-speaking colonists maintained their allegiance to Anglo foodways and their suspicion of foreign terms. This was a process that was assisted primarily by cookbooks. We can look at some of the first American cookbooks, written by women primarily. These are books like Amelia Simmons' American Cookery from 1796, or Lucy Emerson's The New England Cookery from 1808, or Mary Randolph's The Virginia Housewife from 1838. These books largely obliterated the role of Native Americans and the native roots of New World foods that remained the centerpiece of mainstream American cooking. So corn in these cookbooks, rather than being a Native American food, was a Southern food, and tomatoes were rendered into an Italian food. Let's move things forward a little bit. Historians sometimes describe the period between the 1820s and the 1920s as the century of immigration, when millions of primarily European immigrants arrived in the United States. The language that we fall upon when we remember that time conjures up a really welcoming attitude. Those hopeful words of Emma Lazarus engraved at the base of the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. But of course, those huddled masses were precisely the immigrants who white leaders feared as were a threat to the nation's racial purity. America, of course, needed immigrants then as they need immigrants now. Industrialization needed labor, and so complete immigration restriction was unfeasible. But reformers insisted upon assimilating immigrants into proper notions of white Anglo civilization. And that began by changing cooking habits. The kind of bland diet that home economists and others were promoting in this period didn't have much of an appeal to new immigrants arriving in the United States. Let's connect this to something we were talking about just a little bit earlier. Ireland's Great Famine. As the Irish left the blight at home, they couldn't escape that long history of marginalization that they had faced in Britain as colonial subjects since the 16th century. The Irish had long been considered inferior humans by the British, and in American newspapers they were depicted as Irish apes. That was a caricature, and it drew them as equivalent to blacks in America's racial hierarchy. But in what would become a very familiar pattern, their labor was also in really high demand, particularly in the form of the Irish servant girl, who was hired as a domestic servant in many middle-class households in the States. One of the most popular domestic guides in that day, sort of a household manual for how to run your home, was The American Woman's Home. It was published in 1869, and it was written by the abolitionist campaigners Catherine Beecher and Harriet Beecher Stowe. That book was profoundly racist in its approach to the Irish servant girl. The Irish girl was, according to them, a creature of immense bone and muscle, but of heavy, unawakened brain. But the biggest problem about the Irish servant girl for these alleged reformers was that she couldn't cook. And so throughout the 19th century, there were countless rhetorical associations made between Irish women and the preparation of terrible, inedible food. Now, of course, we can look at a different process of racialization through food by looking at the experience of Chinese immigration in a similar period. The American connection to China is very old. By the early 19th century, China represented the largest potential market for American manufactured goods and the largest field for evangelical missionaries. And it was through those early encounters that Americans developed a lasting image of the Chinese people as exotic and backwards and with deplorable foodways. One of the earliest American missionaries to China was S. Wills William, and in 1833 he wrote with disgust about Chinese people eating bird's nest soup, canine hams, cat fricassees, rats, snakes, and worms. These were ugly stereotypes through food, and they were impressions that Americans grafted onto Chinese migrants as they arrived in the United States, beginning with the California Gold Rush of 1849. Chinese food habits became the target of derision, both by immigration restrictionists as well as labor leaders who feared competition from who they described as coolie workers. Gleason's Pictorial Drawing Room Companion was a popular journal based in Boston, and in 1854 it printed a satirical report from a California Chinese restaurant serving cat cutlet, griddled rats, and dog soup and pie. There was another site of fear surrounding Chinese workers that turned very ugly. Union leaders, drawing upon the nutritional ideas of the time, worried that American workers needed meat to work, but Chinese laborers could do that same work only eating rice. In 1802, the American Federation of Labor published an influential pamphlet entitled Some Reasons for Chinese Exclusion: Meat versus Rice, American Manhood versus Asiatic Coolieism. For white Americans, meat, which was growing in access at the time, represented material abundance, power, masculinity, while rice was associated with scarcity, weakness, and femininity. Foods and people were not only racialized, but gendered as well. Talked about the ways in which industrial foods had to overcome great consumer reluctance in the United States, primarily through the new idiom of marketing. And it's probably not surprising by now that the popularization of industrial foods relied upon processes of exclusion and subjugation, and also the creation of idealized domestic models. In 1921, the Washburn-Crosby Company was in the process of becoming the largest flour company in the world through mergers with other grain mills. Again, these were these industrial roller mills, which were still relatively new. To promote its flagship product, gold medal flour, the company created the character of Betty Crocker, who was the figure used to launch promotional cookbooks, records with talking recipes, and kitchen products. She was intended to be a very effective, as well as a very white brand ambassador on air and in print, and in 1945, Fortune magazine ranked her as America's second most popular woman after Eleanor Roosevelt, despite the fact that she was a fictional character. Let's contrast her with the other big female spokeswoman of the day, Aunt Jemima. Aunt Jemima also comes out of the effort to sell more rolled grain. In this case, this was the Pearl Milling Company of St. Joseph, Missouri. Two aspiring marketers came up with a new mix of wheat flour, corn flour, lime phosphate, and salt, and they tried out their new pancake mix on the local librarian, who approved of it. And then in 1889, these two entrepreneurs went to a minstrel show, where they saw what we now would recognize as an ugly sight. A white man dressed up as a black woman who was supposed to be headstrong, fat, and simple-minded. A southern mammy in an apron, a red bandana, blackface of course, singing an old minstrel song, Old Aunt Jemima. From our vantage in the 21st century, this is a pretty hideous performance. It's a white man in drag and blackface. But it also drew upon an image that was supposed to be comforting to many white audiences. This image of the southern slave woman or mammy was a caretaker in the household. As Maurice Manning, the historian, writes, she soothed guilt over slavery, kept white women out of the kitchen, and put hot food on the table. Aunt Jemima was used to market pancakes, but also to remind white audiences of this particular social role. And about 40 years later, Aunt Jemima was joined by another ugly character, Uncle Ben, who was used to sell another form of processed grain, in this time, rice. Even as African Americans were cast into this role of the dumb mammy or uncle who was meant to serve white families, African American foodways were subject to other forms of ridicule in an attempt to maintain white supremacy following the abolition of slavery. After the Civil War, a new, pervasive, and dangerous image emerged of black men as chicken thieves. This was a petty crime, but it conveyed, not so subtly, the supposed illicit desire of blacks to possess all white property, and in this case, it included white women. Black men in this image were anthropomorphized into chickens through a figure of the Zip Coon, a racist caricature of a dandy who preened around like a cock in fancy but shabby clothes, and this image served to mock black men with aspirations of social advancement. White entertainers also staged eating contests for black men and women. They put black men and women on stages and gave them foods to eat for white audiences. Watermelon was a favorite food here, and all of this was used to assert control over black bodies and to shape racial perceptions at a moment when race relations were beginning to change in fundamental ways. Other minority groups were also subject to expropriation and demonization of their food habits. We can look at another process of what we might call food colonialism on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation in Montana, where government agents sought to restructure patterns of subsistence to instill capitalist patterns of wage labor. Indians were encouraged to move on this reservation from hunting buffalo, which were then still wild, to herding domesticated cattle instead. Eventually, there was the construction of a reservation slaughterhouse, and that was a final effort to cleanse the Blackfeet diet of its predatory past. There was also a gendered component of this. There was a butcher shop established on the Blackfeet reservation, and this was a way of delegitimizing the traditionally female labor of preparing meat. Recipes like buffalo bacon were replaced by dishes that were more acceptable and more palatable to European sensibilities. So we've seen a lot of different things today. First, that process of colonial cultural erasure that was involved in the creation of colonial American foodways. Native peoples, enslaved Africans, and non-British immigrants were essential in creating the foodways of North America. But there were big Anglo anxieties about those roles, and they were very quickly erased, repressed, and hidden. Secondly, we saw the ways in which anxieties over new immigration and changing racial roles in the century of immigration played out through the idiom of food, and helped to structure new ideas about eating, race, and the body. These are patterns that have continued well into the 20th and 21st century, even as assimilated versions of ethnic foods gained widespread popularity in the United States, particularly after the passage of immigration reform in 1965. We'll pick up that story very soon, but for now, thanks for joining me, and see you next time.